And today, what I'm going to go over is the role of diagnosis in the career of a professional counselor. So, we'll be looking at a couple of different perspectives on what diagnosis is. It's a very loaded issue, but it's a very important issue. So, let's jump right on in. This is on Blackboard if you're looking for it. If you can't find it or have trouble with it, just shoot me an email at christopher.leith@utsa.edu and I'll get it to you. So, an overview of what we'll be covering: strengths and weaknesses of the DSM, counselor identity versus the medical model, ethical and legal considerations, and bias in diagnosis. So, let's start with why do we diagnose? And take a second and really think about it. If you have plans to go into private practice, or if you're going to work for an agency that maybe really pushes for diagnoses or maybe prohibits diagnoses, right? What do you think about diagnosis? What do you think the utility is? And there are people who are very anti-diagnosis. There are people who are very pro-diagnosis. And as always, the best explanation, the truth, is probably somewhere in between the two, right? So some of the benefits or reasons why we diagnose is for communication among professionals. It ensures a universal language of when I say anorexia, what I'm describing and what I've experienced with that individual is the same thing that you will experience or would have experienced. When I say substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder, you know what I'm referring to, right? We're talking about there is a clinical problem that has seriously impacted negatively this person's life. So it's a universal language. The name of it has certain connotations, it has a set of criteria, and it has ostensibly a treatment plan associated with that diagnosis, so that when I talk to another clinician or a medical provider or whomever, we're all on the same page. Diagnoses also help with referrals, right? It kind of goes hand in hand with what I just spoke about with communications. An effective referral is making a referral for a client that it is beneficial, as opposed to here's a list of 2 or 3 people somewhere in the world, good luck, right? If I know what the problem is and I can kind of put a pin on it and identify it, then I know which providers might be best or which providers I might want to avoid, right? So if I know it's an eating disorder, anorexia, then I know that I'm going to try and network and contact people who have experience working with anorexia. If it's a childhood disorder, then I should probably find a clinician that works with children with diagnoses. So having that helps narrow down the pool. And think, if you're a client, right, if you're seeking counseling, there's so many mental health care professionals out in the world that being able to label what I'm working with or what I think the problem is will greatly reduce the amount of time and energy I need to spend looking for a professional. A diagnosis also helps us focus on symptoms rather than on judging the person. So, by this I mean, when someone has a diagnosis and those symptoms are interfering with the person's life, the problems are the symptoms, not the person. So, take for example, I worked for a very long time with someone who had borderline personality disorder. And I know we haven't covered that yet. So, in a nutshell, very hot and cold, loves you 1 minute, hates you the next, very intense emotions. And we would have that pattern in our counseling relationship. And we had a long stretch where things were going very well. And then one day she came in just fiery hot, looking to start a fight. I could do nothing right. And I'm sitting there in a session, I'm getting really frustrated with the situation. And taking a second, right, taking just a deep breath to kind of cool myself, it's not that she is in a bad mood. It's not that she is this ornery person. It's not that she's some volatile person. It's not that she's mean or bad. That particular day, those symptoms were flared up. The intense emotion, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of doing something wrong in her case. And so going back to instead of saying something like, why are you being like this, which is a very human thing to say, right? But that's what separates the counseling relationship from personal relationships. So instead of saying, what's your problem? Why are you being like this to me? Being able to kind of cool down on my end and say, okay, this isn't her. She's not flip flopping. Um, she's not mad. She's not being angry or trying to start a fight. This is her. These are the symptoms of borderline. And that's what I'm up against. I'm not up against the person, I'm up against the symptoms. And that person is also up against the symptoms. So it kind of removes that self-blame or the judgment of that person. Treatment planning, right? It is impossible to work on something if you don't have a plan. So, on one hand, once we identify what the diagnosis is, we can research it, we can consult, we can put together a plan, we can scale it, we can measure it. And you can also do things like, hey, I don't know what is the best treatment plan, and so we can look, right? We can look it up. Lots of treatment guides, lots of treatment plans. We can look at the literature and see what works best. It gives an explanation and a prognosis to clients, right? So when a client comes in and says, why am I like this? Why can't I get it under control? Why do I always do this? Or like maybe a family member comes in and they say, what's up with my kid? Why is he always picking a fight with me? Why doesn't she eat? Why are they always drinking? There's all that emotion that comes in, and having a professional there, a professional counselor who's able to say, look, what we're dealing with is an addiction, and this is what an addiction, this is how an addiction works. What we're dealing with is bipolar disorder, and what you're seeing is a manic episode. What we're dealing with is oppositional defiant disorder. Whatever it might be, right, we can identify it, and of course the next question is, why me, or how did it get here? And we can kind of explain that. And we can also give a prognosis, right? Diagnosis doesn't stop at, well, looks like it's conduct disorder. See ya, So we say, this is what it looks like. This is what you can expect. An upward trajectory over time with dips and things like that. But we can give an idea to those clients. And then if you're working with insurance, then insurance requires a diagnosis. And also, if a client can only afford counseling through managed care, through their insurance, meaning I can't pay out of pocket, but I can make the copay and I can use my insurance, then it helps them get it. And we have ways of giving an accurate diagnosis that isn't, arbitrary and things like that. But for insurance purposes, diagnoses have to be made. So, from the client's point of view, why would we diagnose? Well, there's a couple benefits. Like I said earlier, the freedom from self-blame, right? So I'm not a bad person. I've just got this thing. It's not that, think of addiction. So it's not that I don't care about my family. It's not that I don't care about my job. It's not that I'm a lush or self-indulgent. It's that I have this addiction, and I've got this reaction that happens when I'm around alcohol, weed, whatever it might be. And so I'm not a bad person. I have this thing that I have to manage. An explanation for what's happening. Many times people will come in. I'll use borderline again. Classically, what happens in the case of borderline, the person comes in, before the diagnosis is made, and they will say, I feel like I'm hot one minute, I'm cold the next minute. I just feel like I'm going crazy. I've had many, many clients say that. I just feel like I'm going crazy. And that's, well, you're not going crazy. This is what happened, right? This is what it is, and this is kind of where it comes from and what happened, and let's talk about that. Let's see if it fits. And it helps them understand. It gives a sense of closure. Everybody wants to know why something is, and sometimes through diagnosis we're able to partially explain that. It helps family and partners understand what's going on, not to blame them, right? Again, with addiction or conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder with little ones, it's not that they're being difficult or choosing these behaviors over you because they're bad. It's that there's this thing, and if we can manage this thing, this this addiction, this disorder, these symptoms, whatever it might be, then we would expect the behavior to kind of migrate more towards normalcy. It can change the counselor's feelings towards the client in a positive way, right? Counselors are just like any other working professional, right? We all have to start somewhere. And a lot of times what people start with is that judgment of their client, right? They want this, they don't want that. And there's all these judgments, but understanding that a client's behavior can heavily be dictated by a diagnosis helps a counselor understand, it's not that they're mean-spirited or self-centered. It's that there are these symptoms, and if we can manage the symptoms, then this person can kind of have the life that they would like to have. Some of the drawbacks to diagnosing: self-fulfilling prophecy. Some of y'all have heard that, right? So what happens, I worked with a lot of young adults, right? Older teens and young adults. And you give a diagnosis, and then it's almost kind of a hall pass to act the way they've been acting, right? So working with someone who has depression, and they truly do have it, and we give the diagnosis, and then it's, oh, I can't go to class, it's my depression. Oh, cater to me, I have depression. Help me, excuse my behavior, excuse me for saying those mean things. It's kind of like when people say, I'm sorry for the things I said when I was hangry, right? Forgive me for what I did, I have this. And it's used almost as a permission slip to act that way, or to continue to a downward spiral. And that's why part of the diagnosis process is explaining exactly that, what a self-fulfilling prophecy is, and what to expect, and how the client can manage those symptoms and their behavior and things like that. Stigma, which will be the biggest one, right? What does that mean? Who knows? And that's a very real one. Counseling already has a huge stigma, or any type of therapy has stigma associated with it. Now when we throw in this thing, and all the person ever knows about is what they see on TV. So it's explaining what it is, and again, sometimes revisiting informed consent and going over confidentiality again. And the biggest thing to remember is that just because you have this doesn't mean that it's going to be this way forever, right? The goal then becomes symptom reduction and management, and then having a life worth living. Limitations on services. And this one is really sticky, right? Like if we diagnose, we'll say anorexia, and insurance says, well, anorexia, we see that there should be a turnaround after 8 sessions, and your client's not showing that turnaround. Well, then it's, sorry, you only have the 8 sessions, or they need to find another counselor, and that's not really fair, is it? So there are things to consider, right? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in any way. There are benefits to diagnosing. Mental illness does exist. The disorders do exist. However, there are some real concerns about getting willy-nilly about throwing diagnoses that do warrant you taking your time and consulting with your peers, and also discussing it with your client if appropriate. Oh my goodness, look at this slide. Counselors and diagnosis, right? So in your intro class, you probably talked about the wellness model and how counselors view clients and people versus the medical model. And so in a nutshell, counselors, we view human functioning, human development, behaviors, thoughts, feelings, all that. We look at the whole person. We look at their age and stage in life. We look at the context. We look at culture, right? Lots of many different ways to define culture, whether it be ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, sex, age, things like that. We look at the whole person, and we look at people change over time, right? Remember those human stages. So, for example, little kids, when they don't get what they want, it's cry. If you're really lucky, they'll throw a tantrum and Target because you didn't get your daughter the little pony, right? And so they freak out. As they get older, though, we expect that to go away, right? We expect them to stop that. We expect another great one, little kids, when you first take them to daycare, in elementary school, they have a hard time being away from the parent, right? There can be some crying and maybe a little tantruming. However, as that child gets older, going to school, maybe it's uncomfortable for them. We don't see the crying, we don't see the tantrum. When we see it later on and they're a teenager and an adult and they're still throwing a tantrum every time they go to work because they miss their parent or their partner, then we're like, hey, there's something amiss here. So we look at it in context. That's the point. We look at it in context. Cries a lot. Well, babies do cry a lot, right? Or maybe the person is crying a lot because there was a death in the family, or they're having a really hard time, they lost their job, right? So we're looking at the whole thing. Client and social advocacy, right? We're trying to help people. We're trying to help groups of people. We consider culture and diversity, right? I'm hesitant to use the word normal. Maybe a better word would be common. What is common or expected in one culture may not be in another, right? And so we see this not as much anymore, but when I was in grad school, a big problem we had with diagnosing was if a man went to counseling and cried or showed his emotion, he would be labeled as he's hypersensitive, and he cries a lot, and maybe being thin-skinned. And if a woman went to counseling and did not cry, right, was just very kind of matter-of-fact, stoic, things like that, she would be labeled as frigid, right, closed off, defensive, right? And so those are cultural things, right? Because traditional masculine norms, big boys don't cry, stiff upper lip, things like that. And for women, it is to be more open about feelings. So we look at culture, and are we diagnosing someone because they are adhering to a different culture than our own? Are we diagnosing because they're maybe my client and I are of the same culture, and I don't think I'm diagnosing them with something because they're not sticking to those traditional cultural roles, right? So we look at that, we ask, we inquire, we research. Anti-reductionistic, that's it, like in a nutshell, right? The medical model has a place. This is nothing against the medical model. This is kind of a history lesson of how we wound up here, right? So the medical model would look at crying a lot. Well, a person shouldn't cry a lot. That's not normal. That's a disorder. That's depression. Being anti-reductionistic would be, why is this person is crying a lot, and no, that shouldn't be happening. But is it really a disorder, or is there something else going on? And that's where you start asking questions such as, when did you start crying? Or, what happened? Well, it all happened after, I lost my job, or I was bullied, or my partner said this really hurtful thing to me, right? And so now that crying has a different meaning other than depression. And we draw on people's strengths and resources, right? Which, in all the other professions' defenses, I think they do that as well. We really kind of, I wasn't there, but professional counseling really stuck the flag in the ground for, hey, we can't just stop at, you cry a lot, that's depression, goodbye, right? It's, well, you're still getting up out of bed and you're going to work and you're not letting people see how miserable you feel. That takes a lot of tenacity. Where is that coming from? How are you managing that? What resources do you have in life? So kind of moving away from that idea that this is you and you alone, right? What strengths do our clients have that we can build on? Don't forget to take a break if you need to. I won't mind, or no. So psychiatry and diagnosis, well, chances are most of you already know this. Psychiatry would deal with medication, so absolutely a medical model, right? They're coming out of medical school. So it's, this person says they feel sad, a person shouldn't feel sad, there's something wrong, let's fix it via medication. They can provide counseling and therapy. I don't know many that do. So a large proportion of them will rely on prescriptions, right? And then it becomes medication management. But this is very much based on what's wrong, identify a problem, label it, diagnose, and then medicate. Clinical psychology, right? Very similar, only minus the medication, right? So they are still, or historically, clinical psychology does come out of a medical model, and we're looking at the brain and brain functions and neural functions. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. Just like with psychiatry, there's nothing wrong with looking at the need for medication and doing medication management. These are the sort of philosophies or perspectives that professions have and how they differ. So whereas psychiatry was very much looking at brain function, abnormality, and medication, clinical psych looks at those same things, but with non-medical treatment. So how can I fix this without prescription, right? So whereas a psychiatrist might look at depression and say, we need to use an antidepressant, clinical psychology might say, well, through talk therapy or talk medicine, as Freud would call it, right? Through talk medicine, can we alleviate some of the symptoms? You still have depression, you still ain't right, but we can maybe talk through it instead of using medication. I'm back up here, back to us. So with counselors, we do acknowledge diagnoses, we do acknowledge brain function, we do all that too, but the model that we come out of is humanistic and wellness based. So we're not as maybe either or, black or white, as the other two, where that's not normal. Not normal means abnormal. Abnormal means diagnosis. We might say, well, that's not healthy, or that's not pleasant. You might even say that's not normal, but you don't rush to diagnosis, right? We look at other things, that context first. So that brings us to, what is a disorder, right? Invariably, when you grow up and you're out and you're on an elevator or an airplane, or you're out at CC's or something, someone will come up to you and say, I got a cousin who does X, Y, and Z. What's he got, right? And so just, we have to have a threshold somewhere before we start saying this is the disorder. Otherwise, we'd all have like everything, right? You can look in your DSM right now, pick any of the diagnoses, probably almost any diagnosis, squint your eyes and fit yourself or a family member into it, right? So we've got to kind of look at what do we mean by disorder, right? And who decides what's healthy and normal? So this is sort of how I conceptualize whether or not to make a diagnosis. And this is what I tell students, right, to kind of help. The 4 Ps, right? Is there a problem? Is there a pattern? Is it pervasive? And is it persistent? Problematic, right? So is there even a problem? It's an important question, right? Overdiagnosis is a real problem. And overdiagnosis occurs, or one of the reasons it occurs is because it's creating a problem out of nothing, right? My kid can't sit still. That must be ADHD. It has to be. But then you dig a little deeper. How are his grades? Oh, they're fine. He's on a roll. Oh. Well, does he have friends? Oh, lots of friends. Very popular. He's got a best friend and everything. Okay. Well, he must be driving you guys nuts at home. No. No, actually. He does his chores. He's a great kid. Very respectful. Does everything. So where's the problem, right? Maybe it's just a kid that has a lot of energy. Excuse me. They don't prepare you for what to do with dry throat when you're doing online asynchronous classes. So what's the problem then? So maybe he is overactive. Maybe he's got a lot of energy. Maybe you pump him full of sugar, right? Who knows? But there's not a problem. He's just an active child. So is there a problem? Is there a pattern? This is where I find really helps you narrow down if there's an issue or a clinical issue. So we were looking for the symptoms, right? So in that previous example, a parent says, my kid just can't sit still. That alone is not sufficient, right? Maybe there is a problem, right? Let's revise it. They say, yeah, there's a problem. He's driving us nuts, failing some of his classes. Well, that plus just being overactive isn't enough. What other symptoms are we seeing? And when we look at the symptoms, what diagnosis do they make? So a symptom is just one element of a diagnosis, right? It's one criterion. A diagnosis is a constellation of symptoms. So, think of the constellations in the sky. You look at any one star, and it doesn't look like anything, right? It's just a star. Let me see, can I make this work? Right, here's one star. Guess I could have done that. Right, so we just have the one. But if they're arranged in such a way that it's like, oh wow, look, we've got overactivity, we've got spaciness, we've got fidgeting, we got all this stuff. Look, we've got a Big Dipper, right? So looking at one symptom doesn't give you anything. It's only when they're arranged in an identifiable pattern and a constellation that we have a diagnosis. So we got to see a pattern. You can't just go off of one. In fact, if someone came to you and gave you 10, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, there's a bunch of this, but it doesn't really make anything, right? That might just be someone who's really frustrated and describing all the things they don't like about a family member or about themselves, right? So we've got to have a few symptoms, and they got to be arranged in such a way that they make a diagnosis. And that's what the DSM is for. But let's say there is a pattern, right? So revisiting this child, there's a problem, he's got a pattern, looks like ADHD. Do we see those problems and patterns across context? Is it pervasive through different areas? If it's only at home, or only at school, or only at work, I tend to raise an eyebrow. So for example, mom and dad say, he won't sit still, the teacher says he's always fidgeting, he's failing math, and he's failing English, and we don't know what's going on. We think it's ADHD, and it does sound like ADHD, but it's only in math, and it's only in English. Otherwise, there's no problem. Come to find out, though, the school bully is in his math and his English class. He's fidgety because he's nervous. He's distracted because he's scared. Right? So it's less of an ADHD problem and more of a fear or nervousness problem, right? Or on a more positive example, maybe someone's spaced out, right? They look like they're daydreaming all the time. It sounds like inattentive ADHD. Turns out their crush is in math and English, right? It's a heart. And persistence. Are the problems in the pattern it's seen across context? So let's say mom and dad say, yes, there's a problem. He's failing school. He's failing all his classes. And the pattern is ADHD. So we've got the problem. We've got the pattern. We've got the pervasiveness. Is it persistent across time? Right? Because you're all, I say you all like I'm not part of it, we're all capable of having a bad day. Right? So someone goes through a divorce, has a death in the family, a child moves to a new city, right? And we see that they're having a hard time, and then it kind of lets up, right? So they had he failed his classes, It looked like ADHD. It was in all of his classes because there was a very volatile student bully in all of his classes. And when that student was removed or the problem was addressed, this child's grades went up, right? So we need to see it across time. Now the thing is that the timeline, like how much time do you give something, that varies based on the diagnosis. So for example, think of depression. Well, how many of us have had a day where we were really, really bummed out about something, where maybe you were really upset because we didn't get a job we wanted, or we failed something, or went through a breakup, a death in the family, something like that, and you just can't get it. Absolutely looks like depression. You met all the criteria, except for depression symptoms have to be present for at least 2 weeks, right? So, in the case of insomnia, how many of you have had sleepless nights, right? We got to have those sleepless nights for like 3 months, right? So it's not just one time; it has to be through time, and the DSM will specify how long those symptoms are present, and some of them are very long, in my opinion. Some of them are very short, and most of them are kind of in between. There's nothing inconsistent with being a professional counselor and making diagnoses, right? We just have to be careful so that way we don't overdiagnose or misdiagnose, right? To take the stance of I'm not ever going to diagnose, which you can do. You can go open up a practice and just do private pay and never diagnose. But this stance of I don't believe in diagnosis means that you also have to believe that people don't have addictions, that PTSD doesn't exist, that schizophrenia doesn't exist, that eating disorders don't exist. To be on the other hand and have the need to diagnose everybody means that someone who thought they heard a knock at the door at 3 in the morning, you're going to say is schizophrenia. Someone who says, I wish I could lose weight, I'm unhappy with my body, you'll say is body dysmorphic disorder, right? And that's where misdiagnosis and overdiagnosis comes from. It's a balancing act of when is it appropriate to diagnose. And that's why I say use those 4 Ps, right? Is there a problem? Because if there isn't one, or if the problem's unrelated to any kind of symptomatic behavior, then that's not the issue. Is there a pattern, right? So do you even meet the criteria for a diagnosis? Is it across context, or is it isolated to one thing? Like a child is very wild and crazy and a misfit, but only at home, but a perfect model student at school, right? I think that probably speaks more to the home environment than it does the diagnosis, right? And is it through time, or was it, hey, the family pet died, super morbid, but the family pet died, and he was really upset. He was grieving, right? Overdiagnosis is giving a diagnosis when one is not warranted. And this happens because counselors, or those counselors, not us as a whole, have a low threshold for what they'll say, oh, that's problematic, right? Think of the magnitude of these things, right? To give a diagnosis, that set of symptoms has to interfere significantly with the person's life. Now, what is significant? That's up to you and your client. But those symptoms have to interfere with the person's academic, social, vocational life, and some of them allow for personal distress. And so if you lower your threshold and the person says, sorry, I was late 5 minutes to work, and my boss was really upset at me, I just couldn't get out of bed, and you say 5 minutes late to work and couldn't get out of bed, that sounds like depression to me, right? That's a low threshold. People who go looking for a diagnosis, right? So we're going to start on the foot of what's wrong, which is so antithetical to being a counselor, right? To start with that's not normal, right? It inherently means you have to take a stance of what's right and what's not. Or rushing, right? You're not taking the time to ask the questions you should. You're not researching. Was it was that a symptom for this or that? And, just not taking the time to ask follow-up questions of your client or to research in the DSM. Misdiagnosis is giving the wrong diagnosis, right? And that, again, is rushing, not being familiar with the DSM, right? So, yeah, kind of an over sense of confidence. I think I got the gist of it. I think I know the criteria for these disorders, and not checking it, not examining with the client, right? Asking the follow-up questions, not reviewing the DSM criteria, or massaging the client description into diagnosis, right? So the person says, sometimes I feel sad. Well, what do you mean by sometimes? Sometimes it should be never, right? And so let me force it into a diagnosis of depression. So what do we do, right? What's this all about? Take your time with clients. Ask questions. Look for sources of symptoms, right? That the clients will start off with symptoms. Your next step is to ask, when did that happen? What changed then? And that helps prevent over and misdiagnosis, right? Because maybe what the client's experiencing is attributable to a non-clinical issue. Be familiar with the sections of the DSM. As I said in the intro video, the expectation is not that you memorize every criteria. It's not the expectation that you memorize every disorder. I do think it's a reasonable expectation to be familiar with the sections, right? That we have one for substance use and eating and body concerns and depression and bipolar, right? To be familiar that there are these different sections, so that way you can kind of quickly jump to it and kind of start reviewing. Ask for collateral information. If you work with youth, this is easy, right? You're asking the guardians, you're consulting with the pediatrician, with schools and stuff like that. But also, clients are given confidentiality, absolutely, and you should never break that unless you need to for one of those reasons, right? Suicide, homicide, etc. But you can always ask, how do you think, how would you feel about bringing your partner in for a session? Or how do you feel about letting me speak to one of your parents or something like that? It never hurts to ask. The worst that happens is they say, no, I don't want you to, and that's it, right? But getting collateral information is helpful. And consult, right? Talking to other professionals. You think it's one thing, you're not sure. Talking to a peer or an expert can help you eliminate or rule out certain ideas. It can help you generate questions to ask your client or do an assessment to figure out what it might be, right? The biggest thing that I can tell you is to take your time, right? This class is all about diagnosis. And so, like, every example I'm going to give is going to be like a diagnosis. In practice, I'm very conservative with diagnosis. I'm not anti-diagnosis, but I take my time, right? That's the last thing that I give on a very short list, right? Is this a reaction? Is it a context? And after going through all these other things, is this like a normal reaction to a change in the person's life? Then I start considering, is it a diagnosis? So you take your time. So let's wrap up here. Diagnosis is not a bad thing. We just want to be helpful with it and ethical with it. The DSM, the rub with all of this is that the DSM is a tool that tries to take subjective experiences like sadness and turn it into an objective measurement. And that's really hard to do. And at a certain point, and some of you are going to love this and some of you are going to be uncomfortable with it, a lot of this comes down to it's your clinical judgment, right? Is this a reasonable time to expect someone to feel unhappy? Is the kid fidgeting a lot, right? So some of those things, it's difficult because unless it's bam, right in your face, like, here's the problem, yeah, you will wind up in a gray area, and that can be uncomfortable, but you can get through it, and you will. It comes down to, I think it's a problem, or no. I think maybe it is a problem, but I don't think it's a diagnosis, right? Or I think this is the problem. So it really is going to come down to your clinical judgment. That might be it. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to wrap up then. Excuse me. Oh, this dry throat is killing me. I hope everyone is well. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. And I'm still working on a cool sign off. I don't have one just yet, but one day. So I guess I'll see y'all at the next session. All right, guys. Take care. Bye.